So this week we're going to be discussing many of the changes that happen in Scotland throughout the period of the Victorian era. For many people, Scotland is an anomaly. They don't really remember Scotland much in terms of the Industrial Revolution or in terms of the major changes that are happening during the Victorian period. But it obviously is a significant portion of the British tale and one that we have to encounter here. So before we sort of dive into what are the big changes going on in Scotland in the 19th century, I want to look at just a map to sort of acquaint ourselves with what we'll be talking about. So obviously Scotland is the northern part of the island of Great Britain. So England is obviously the southern portion. Wales is off to the bottom, off to the west coast of England. Ireland obviously is the separate island, but then you have Scotland in the north, right? So Scotland is a very difficult place to travel through, particularly in the 18th and 19th century and earlier. Scotland is very, very mountainous, particularly in the Highlands in the northern part. There are a lot of rivers. It's a very difficult place to travel through. Compounding that is also that Scotland has a ton of islands off the coast, off the west coast, and also off the east coast, particularly in the southeast, but that's not imaged here. There are a lot of islands. So it makes it very difficult to travel through. That changes in the 19th century, that changes in the 18th century, at least between the major industrial centers. When we talk about Scotland, we talk about the Highlands and we talk about the Lowlands. So the Lowlands typically are considered sort of from Perth and south, and the Highlands are basically Perth and north. We call this portion of Scotland that I'm currently encircling basically from the Aran Islands and Ayr, basically to St. Andrews and Edinburgh. We consider this the central belt of Scotland, stretching as far back as the 1700s. This is where the predominant amount of Scots live. They live in the central belt of Scotland. The two major cities are Glasgow and Edinburgh. In the 21st century, they're about an hour apart by road, but within in the 1800s, you're talking something that was like about a 12-hour coach ride. A very difficult stretch of road to go past. This area also becomes the predominant industrial center for Scotland. Glasgow and Edinburgh are both the sort of industrial hubs of Scotland, and that there are other parts that will become significant as well, particularly in this portion of Scotland. You have towns like Dundee, Dunfermline, names that would be familiar from your reading, that pop up as well. So let's talk about Scotland in the 1800s. Scotland in the 1800s sees a massive boom in industrialization. We're going to be talking about Edinburgh and Glasgow in particular, and the surrounding areas, sort of the suburb areas of those places, which are talked about in the reading. But they have a massive amount of industrialization, industrial growth because of the towns that pop up here. There is a huge new portions of the cities that are built. So they are using steel to produce larger buildings, so you can have multiple families going into them. And towns become to get segregated or stratified. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. There is a growing connection outside of Scotland, so that different towns, different parts of the empire are now being wrapped up in the Scottish connection, right? So, there are goods being produced in Scotland that are being shipped to Africa, India, and goods are being sent, or raw materials, more importantly, are being sent from India and Africa to Scotland to be refurbished and then sent back. This is most important. This is not talked about in your reading, but I do want to mention it here because it is so important to the Scottish story, is shipbuilding. Much of Scotland, and weaving to a certain extent, but much of Scotland, and particularly in the west of Scotland, in this portion of Scotland, is focused on shipbuilding. The major river is the river that goes through Glasgow, called the Clyde River. The River Clyde is extremely important to British shipbuilding in the late 19th century and into the 20th century. And it employs a huge number of people. So the Clyde River, which is the river I just mentioned, is hugely significant for a couple of reasons. One, southwest Scotland and really southern Scotland, the Central Belt, has a huge amount of coal within it. And this gives shipbuilding a particular importance. These are all coal burning ships, and they need the coal to power the industrial revolution that's going on within Scotland. So coal becomes an extremely important portion of this, and that leads to people who need to mine the coal, people who need to run the factories, build the ships. So there's a huge demand for labor in southwest, particularly the southwestern portion of Scotland, but also, again, all through that central belt of Scotland. This also means that you have the ability for increased railways. You have larger connections of larger urban centers that are moving people to and from different facilities. But you also need to move goods, right? If you're moving coal from the coal pits to the factory, you need to do that by railroad. If you're moving, portions of a ship produced, outside of a city center, you need to move it inward. So all of this increases the demand for labor, and Southwest Scotland is in particular demand for that. Relatively, Scotland also had much lower wages. Because there was, obviously supply and demand, right? There are more people, and the wages are significantly undercut. Scots make about £70 per year compared to 76, roughly a 10% reduction in wages to people in England or in Wales. This means that Scotland becomes extremely stratified, and Scottish cities become particularly stratified. And in Glasgow, the largest city in Scotland, even today, Glasgow is particularly impacted. In the east portion of Glasgow, which is where the sort of industrial workers lived, you had a section called the Gorbals, and the Gorbal section is particularly overcrowded in the industrial era. You have about 40,000 people living in about every square kilometer. So that is a huge significant, that's a big population, population density, and that means that people are living in really deplorable conditions. Now you move into the 20th century, obviously outside the scope of what we're discussing here, but because of high rents, because of inadequate pay, salaries, people can afford these houses. So what happens is many of these houses wind up becoming unoccupied. So let's turn our attention to the reading then. So let's talk about some specific numbers discussed in the reading, right? Glasgow and Edinburgh, the two major industrial centers, see huge increases in population. Scotland, again, is a small provincial country outside of England, really sort of connected to England through, sort of tangentially in a lot of ways through through the late 18th century. But then we get to 1801, and by the 19th century, by the time we're talking about the Victorian era, populations begin to boom. Glasgow goes from 77,000 to 280,000 people in a 40-year period. So that's what, a 4-time increase, 400% in 40 years. Now, obviously, infrastructure doesn't keep up with that. Edinburgh has doubles in that period. By the end of the century, Glasgow goes to 780,000, and this is Edinburgh, goes to 400,000. So we're again talking about huge increases in population. Small towns also have these massive growths, and And there are increased developments of homes, right? Many of the homes that are popping up in the early 19th century are made of wood. They're not very sturdy buildings. But by the end of the century, you start having something called the council houses. So, what is a council house? These would be sort of public housing provided by people by the town. So, in Scotland, it's the town council who runs the town, right? And so in New York City, we have the city council, or you might have sort of a local government. In Scotland, it's a town council. So town council builds houses, and they are called council houses. These council houses are homes that people can rent relatively cheaply, and it gives them the ability to have a steady home for their family. Um, and that really starts in the late 1800s. Some of them call them, the Glasgow Cooperative or the Edinburgh Improvement Society, right? These are just different names that are given uh, to different agencies that are building homes for people. Unfortunately, the real impact of this is that there is huge class stratification. As these different communities are being popped up, right, council houses become known as slums, or at least become known as sort of the ghettos, right? The the projects, right? They're places where people, where the working class live. And as a result of that, you also have different houses being built, right? And they're sort of very structured. So this is a picture of Glasgow's West End, where you have developments, right? Nice row homes. You could see that there's sort of straight boulevards in them. Again, it's really meant parks, right? These are ways to develop um, sort of classed societies. And to such as this, or the West End in Glasgow becomes a very middle class society. This is where people would live who are the sort of managers of a factory. Newtown would be the same in Edinburgh. Within these different communities, particularly obviously the slums and the poor communities, diseases are ever present. Because the infrastructure in certain communities cannot keep up with the population growth, and this is certainly true in different portions of um, areas outside of Glasgow and Edinburgh, cholera and typhus are perennial problems. And instead of trying to find sort of the reason, that there's, no sewage being drained out of these communities, and that's causing disease, people blame it on the working class themselves. So you have this idea, and this is a very Victorian belief, that poverty is based on personal failure. So that there are different groups that come in to try and improve, poor drinking habits, and that's obviously alcohol drinking, immoral behavior, people not going to church, um, and not necessarily finding the root problem, which is poor sanitation. Christian churches also get involved here. So there's a group that's really active in Scotland called the Scottish Society for the Propagation of Christian Faith, which is just a fantastic name, right? And they and others, the Presbyterian Church, the Free Church of Scotland, and others, wind up trying to really target communities and really indoctrinate them, really try and, again, not looking at the root of the problem, which is poor sanitation, overcrowding, but rather they'll give out Bibles and try and force people to Christianize rather than, do things that we in the 21st century today know really stem disease. You also have an increase in, again, sort of coupling with this, particularly in the later portion of this, right in the last quarter of the last quarter of the 19th century, you have really great civil engineering going on. Areas outside of Scotland, Scotland's Central Belt, right? So when we start looking at Dunfermline, which is up here in just north of Edinburgh, or you look at Coat Bridge, which is talked about in the article, right? Coat Bridge is south of Glasgow, Motherwell. These are names that really start getting civil engineering. And by the 1870s, many of waterworks are beginning to bring in different water sources into communities. So we also have, one of the other names mentioned is Dumbarton. Dumbarton also is a community within Glasgow now. It's been absorbed by Glasgow, and through 1870s and 1880s, you start having fresh water being piped in and reservoirs being created. Again, ways to try and improve the lives of the slums, and ways to try and move and clean out different communities, right? You start having water closets, toilets, right, to try and, again, clean out, use increased sanitation. The final two things I'd like to talk about here are, again, about the people. So in the 1870s and 1880s, you have a couple of laws that are meant to, again, try and improve different areas within Scotland. So local communities are given the ability to demolish overpopulated buildings, or buildings that are considered slums. Medical officers are employed by the town councils to improve public health. The really one that I think is the most insidious here is giving sort of a certificate of occupancy. How many people can you have in this home? And then foreclosing on those buildings, right? This is a way really of rooting out people. And again, it's not trying to improve the lives of the people, and that's the cross acts. The cross acts give local governments the ability to say 2,000 people can live in this building. They count the number of people, and then they can sort of foreclose on it or force people out of that housing. What's interesting here is that does nothing to solve the problems that the people are experiencing, but it rather just sort of pushes them out and says, now it's somebody else's problem. Again, these are in the Victorian era. For Victorian people, it was not how do we help these people. This is their problem. They have created it. They have moral failings. How can they improve their own lives? And finally, the last big thing that's discussed in the article is leisure time. The Industrial Revolution does one really great thing, many great things, but one of the great things that it does for average people is it gives them disposable income, and it pushes a lot of people into one place. What that means is people now have money in their pockets to spend doing things that they enjoy. So one such thing that happens is sporting events generally, and this is true sort of universally in the late 19th century, pop up. So in Scotland, you have the Hibernians that are from outside of Edinburgh. In Glasgow, you have two teams. And this is really interesting, right? The Glasgow Rangers and the Glasgow Celtic. So the Glasgow Rangers are typically connected with Protestants, while the Celtics, being sort of more of an Irish background, are more connected to Catholics. And it creates a problem between sort of religious groups, Protestants versus Catholics. And that happens throughout Scotland. There's other groups that pop up here, right? But if just to sort of step back for a second, this is also true in other parts of the world, right? In America, baseball pops up in the late 19th century. The Chicago Cubs are founded in the 1890s, and other teams as well. There's also an increase of pub culture, and Scotland had a phenomenal amount of pubs for people, right? You have some disposable income. You can now go spend it in alehouses. So in Glasgow, there are 2,500 pubs within the city, right? And when you're talking by the late 19th century of a city of 780,000, you could do the math, right? But that's a tremendous amount of pubs for that number of people. In Dundee, so Dundee is again sort of in this portion of Scotland. Dundee has one pub for every 24 families. So you're talking a huge number of pubs for the number of people in the cities. Scottish cities, just like every other part of Britain, are fundamentally really changed during the 19th century. And those changes are crucial to understanding sort of Victorian understandings of people, right? these are workers, these are people who need to be cared for, and how we care for them is very different. So good luck, take care.